In 1951, Stuart Maxwell was crossing a road when he was struck by a car driven by Lionel Murphy, not, I hasten to say, the High Court judge by that name. Unfortunately, Mr. Maxwell died from his injuries. At the time of his death, there was legislation in place to allow for the compensation of a person's relatives in situations like this, but the action had to be brought within 1 year of the person's death. In this case, Mr. Maxwell's widow, Kitty, missed that 12-month deadline. However, in 1953, the Parliament changed the legislation so that now an action could be brought within 6 years of the death. Relying on this section, Kitty Maxwell commenced an action for compensation by Mr. Murphy. This was a tricky legal situation because at the time of Mr. Maxwell's death, the limit was 1 year, but now the limit was 6 years. The amendment to the legislation didn't include any transitional provisions to help work through situations like this one. The real question from a legal perspective was whether the change to the legislation could be said to have a retrospective effect. Justice Kitto explained the principle in a way that has been quoted many times since. He said, "The general rule of the common law is that a statute changing the law ought not, unless the intention appears with reasonable certainty, to be understood as applying to facts or events that have already occurred in such a way as to confer or impose or otherwise affect rights or liabilities which the law had defined by reference to those past events." So how does this general principle apply in the case of Mrs. Maxwell? On the one hand, of course, it's very easy to have sympathy for her and quite hard to have sympathy for Mr. Murphy, the negligent driver. But the role of the court is to do justice, not to play favourites. 1 year after the accident, when no action had been taken by Mrs. Maxwell, Mr. Murphy was effectively discharged from any potential liability. He was entitled to move forward, free from concern about any action being taken against him. It would be unfair to suddenly reimpose upon him a potential liability that he had already been discharged from. The court refused to apply the legislation retrospectively, and unfortunately, Mrs. Maxwell was left without a remedy.